Good morning, everyone. This is Lance Yoder from Clear Process Solutions. Welcome to this month's webinar for CPS WEBTips for WINSHUTTLE. We're just at the top of the hour here, so we'll wait just a minute or two to allow any other attendees to join. So I'm going to go on mute here for just a minute or so, and we'll get started soon. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. It's a couple of minutes after the hour here, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining August WEBTips for WINSHUTTLE. Let's go ahead and dig in. So everyone's going to be on mute just by default here. We'll try to get to some questions along the way. So in your GoToWebinar menu, you should have the ability to raise your hand or type in a question, and we'll pause throughout the presentation to get some of those questions looked at and reviewed and see if we can answer those along the way. So just about myself, my name is Lance Yoder. I've been with Clear Process now for about 4 years, and my background was a WINSHUTTLE user myself. I've been using SAP for a number of years as well. Used WINSHUTTLE a lot, the studio tools to help with data migrations and conversions, and my background with SAP is really master data and business process within the SAP space. I've used transaction query for a long time and received a golden brushy from WINSHUTTLE in 2013 when I was a customer for innovative use of their tools for Material Master. So I'm pretty versed with it, and we'll see what we can learn here today. So today's topic is going to be about user governance. So we're talking about Foundation 11 user governance. So we've done a couple of WEBTips previously on the version 11 of Studio, the differences in transaction and query and some of the new features and the new layouts of that. So we wanted to move on a little bit and talk about user governance for Foundation 11 as well. If you're not a full Foundation customer, that's okay. You can still use the user governance module. In the old 10X world, this was previously called Central, so WINSHUTTLE Central, and they have rebranded it with the release of Studio 11 to be called user governance. So a lot of the same types of features if you've used user governance before. So I'm just going to do a quick poll. Let's see if I can figure out how this technology works and do a poll. So let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to launch this one right here. Just a simple question. Are you currently using Studio 11? I'll just give a few seconds here for people to vote. Okay, it looks like we got most people voting, so let's go ahead and see what the results are. And we'll share that. Okay, so it looks like 60% of the folks are using Studio 11 and 40% are not. So we're slowly getting folks migrated to version 11, which is good. Recommend trying to stay on the latest and greatest if possible. I realize that it's hard to upgrade all of the time, but hopefully you have the opportunity to. And then the second one I'm going to ask here real quick is, for those people that are using Studio 11, are you using the user governance? So if you're using Studio 11, if you want to answer the next one here to see if you're using user governance, or maybe you don't know. Okay, so let's take a look at those results here real quick. All right, and we'll share that. So it looks like no one is using Foundation 11 user governance. So that must mean either you're not sure or you're using Connect. So this will be good. It's a little bit of to go through an admin part of it, but we want to ensure that you're up to speed on some of these concepts should you want to use the Foundation 11 user governance module. Again, you can use the user governance module whether or not you have the full foundation, including the forms and workflows. So if you're just the Studio customer, you can still use the Foundation 11 user governance as well. So we're going to go ahead and get rid of those polls. I think I got them out of the way. All right, so the first thing we're going to look at are the topics. We're going to learn how to add users, add application servers, update policies, review preferences, discuss content and structure, and determine approval strategies. So some of these items are more generic. They're not necessarily Foundation 11 or user governance specific. The content and structures, those are more for just general best practices for naming folders and scripts and things like that. So if you don't have Foundation 11, that's okay. Some of it still be applicable if you want to learn about it, or some of the other options as well. So we're going to go through the slides here. I do have a lot of content in here. We're not going to read all of that, but I did want to show that because since this is being recorded, it'll be nice to have that content available for after the session is over and this has been posted online. So when we're talking about adding users, let's first take a look at what Foundation 11 looks like. I'm sorry, the user governance, what that looks like. So it's it's still based upon a SharePoint site unless you're using WINSHUTTLE online. If you're using WINSHUTTLE sort of on premise, it's using a SharePoint site here, and it has similar look and feel to Central if you were using Central before. A lot of the concepts are the same, but the layout is a little different, a little bit more user-friendly in my estimation. So when you're adding a user, in the old Central version, it was like 7 different steps to get a new user in there. So fortunately, with Foundation 11, it's relatively straight. Yes.
We can't see any slides.
Can't see any slides. All right. How about?
Yes.
How about now? Thank you for that. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. Okay, slides are now changing. There we go. All right, we're back in action. All right. So I'll go back and show that slide again so it's captured, but this is what Foundation User Governance 11 looks like. Again, very similar look and feel on the left side to what you were used to in Central if you were using Central. But looking at how to manage users, it's a little bit easier because WINSHUTTLE has now eliminated a lot of the steps. So if we wanted to go through the process of adding a user, we would go to Users and then select Add User. And we have the ability to add users in a multiple fashion. We can import a single user, which is what we're going to do today. You can import from an Excel file, a SharePoint group, or an Active Directory group. So a lot easier to manage multiple users. If you get a new batch of licenses and you'd have all the users you want to assign in an Excel file or a SharePoint group, you could manage them a little bit easier. But what we're going to do here is we're just going to select import a single user. I'm going to select next. In the username, so this is hooked up to your Active Directory through SharePoint. So I'm going to put in students 083. I think that's a user in our system we can add. I'm going to go validate that that's a real user. Yep, looks good. Validated that. And I'm going to go fetch the details, which should fill in a lot of this other information for me. Okay, so this is just a real generic user, sort of a dummy user in our system. So it doesn't really have an email address. So we'll put one in. Okay, that looks good. And we'll go ahead and assign a license to them. So you can see the licenses that are available show up right here. So I'm going to select Enterprise Studio. Okay, so it's selected that, and selecting the licensing pack or the Foundation license if there was one. If you didn't have Foundation, that's okay. That might not show up. And then here you can allow that user to be a part of all of these roles right up front. So this all looks good. I'm going to have them. I don't want them to be a dictionary administrator or a reviewer or a script reviewer. All right, so I'm just going to allow them to develop and run scripts. And I'm going to set their query preference proficiency level to advanced. So in the old Central model, you would have had to go to a different screen for all of these. You would have had to add a user. You had add a user to one of the groups. Then you'd have to assign them a license. And then you'd have to put them in different groups. And then you'd have to, like, all of these things were different steps. So it's sort of painful. And we had a document to walk people through how to manage licenses. So, it's version 11, user governance, a lot easier to manage users. So I'm going to go ahead and select next. And it should get all that to work. So you can see license status was successful, Enterprise Studio, and the student name. So at this point, I have done all I've needed to do for that particular user. And let's take a look under managing license. So that was about how to add users. You could also manage users in groups. So if you wanted to pick a particular user to manage, So I'm going to put in student and search for all the usernames that have student in their username, which we should have a number of them on our system. You can see now that student 83, which I've added down here, simply has script developer and script runner. So if I wanted to edit that user, I would just select the user here and I could edit. And now I can edit the roles and manage their query proficiency levels all in one spot. Again, much simpler than adding people to all these different groups. So if you wanted to manage a user after they're added, that's how you would do that. Looking at licenses, if you wanted to manage licenses, this allows you to see what licenses you have in your system and then add or subtract or whatever you'd like from there. So we just assigned student 83 a license, so you can hear student 83 is assigned a license. It's a subscription, and here are the details. It expires January 1st, and so on. So if you're using perpetual licenses, so most customers do have perpetual, meaning they will never expire. Ours are all subscriptions, so we have to get new ones every year. That's why you see the dates here. But you could easily take that away. If you want to manage that license, you could select the checkbox, and you could revoke that license. You could take it away. You could switch that user to another admin, or you could manage a foundation license as well. So the interesting thing about this new setup is that in User Governance 11, it has some of the features that Connect had. So if you're a Connect user, within Connect, you could assign licenses to a particular license administrator. So if you had various departments that have WINSHUTTLE Studio or transaction or query, whatever the license type may be, you could assign those users or those licenses to a particular admin for that group. So maybe you have a department, we'll call it finance, and finance has its own sets of licenses. So you would assign a finance admin for licensing, and they would get 5 licenses. And maybe you had a master data team that had 10 licenses, and you could assign them as well. So that was only something that was available in Connect. So that allows those departments to manage their own license counts instead of having one group, fighting over the whole bucket when maybe they didn't buy the license. And so now you can reserve them for a particular group. And that's what a license admin is. You can see we have different license admins here. I'm one of them. But I think all of our licenses are assigned to this particular user, so you would see them. So if you didn't have access as a license administrator, you wouldn't be able to assign licenses. So that's a particular role within the site. Within Foundation 11 User Governance, one thing to note is that the number of moves. So in order to eliminate companies from constantly switching the users around and assigning licenses from person A to person B, back to person A, back to person B, right? So that's sort of going against the idea of what the licensing agreement is. WINSHUTTLE has established this concept called moves, the number of times you can reassign a license within I believe it's a 90-day period. So you can reassign it up to 2 more times after your initial assignment. So if you can move it between A and B and a couple of times, and that will reset every quarter to get new moves. So it's really just trying to manage licenses in a more, I guess, ethical sense, right? If you need more licenses, then you can buy some, but they're trying to avoid the back and forth from that. So you can see all your licenses here. You could also assign a license if you wanted to right from here, but it doesn't automatically provide all of the groups that you would need to do. So you would have to still add a user. You could only pick the only users that show up here are the users that have been added through that add user mechanism, up here. So if you added a new user but did not assign them a license, for example, you could always come back in here and assign them a license this way or through the manage users. All right, so that's a little bit about managing adding users. So I will go back to this slide here real quick so it shows up on the webinar. Okay, we talked about assigning licenses and roles. So again, you could do that through the add user section, or you could do it through the license management portion as well by selecting that particular user from the license list and then adding their particular roles. Okay, adding SAP application servers. So when you're doing your initial setup, as part of the user governance tool, this allows you to manage what SAP environments can be used with WINSHUTTLE. So depending upon your access level to the user governance site, you may have this black bar up here, you may not. Most of you will at least have settings if you're just a normal user of the licenses and the desktop tools. You would have settings and then maybe manage credentials, my settings, and maybe one other icon. But since I'm an administrator, I have a little bit more access. So let's select the SAP application servers here. So this allows us to manage, again, what SAP environments can be used with WINSHUTTLE. It's not stopping you from using your own access and logging into SAP, as you see fit from your desktop or through Enterprise Portal or however you log in. So you may have access to many environments, maybe a dev, a QA, or production or something like that, and many different varieties. But to use WINSHUTTLE against those environments within the user governance module, you have to have them set up as a specific ID. So in the setup process, we'll go ahead and add a new server. So let's pretend we're going to add a new server. I'm just going to make one up here. System ID, we'll call it ABC, and client 400. And then you have to give it a server type, a production or non-production. So if you have a non-production environment like a dev or QA, or you probably have multiple different tracks of devs and QAs, and if you're lucky, you only have one production, but sometimes you have multiple production environments if you've done an acquisition or whatever. But this is an important distinction because within user governance, a user cannot develop scripts in a server that's identified as production. So if I defined ABC, my SAP system client 400 as a production SAP environment, I wouldn't be able to create any scripts in that environment. I would have to create them against the non-production environment, and then when the script is approved, then I would be able to run it in that production environment. But this really enables that, a real nice development process where, you shouldn't be developing scripts within your production environment. You should be developing them in non-production, testing them, and making sure everything's going to work okay before doing so. So I'm going to just leave this as non-production here. And this is really all the setup you would need to do to add a new SAP environment. If you were setting this up to be used with Foundation, so the forms and workflow tools, or wanted some advanced logon, you would have to provide some additional information here, the application server host and the instance number. And generally your SAP team will know what that information is, or you can find it directly from your logon pad, so your SAP logon pad will have some information there as well. So that's how you add an SAP application server. We'll just toggle back here, and I'm going to say none, and then we'll go ahead and hit save. Yep. So it's just warning you because I didn't provide any logon details. You won't be able to save any SAP credentials until we do that, and that's fine. So that means when you get prompted to log into SAP, you'll just have to provide your credentials at that time instead of picking the credentials you maybe have saved within Foundation. Okay, so that's a little bit about adding application servers. Again, that really defines what people can connect to with WINSHUTTLE. So it gives the governance team a good way to manage what people can do where. So again, WINSHUTTLE is not trying to go around your SAP access. It's trying to help manage, in a more refined way, even down to T codes and what systems you can connect to and things like that. So that's adding application servers and the impact that it has on a user. So let's move on to the next one, which is updating policies. Okay, so policies are much like SAP security roles. If you get a role that has certain T code access, you can then go manage those T codes. If you don't have that role, you can't use those T codes. So within WINSHUTTLE user governance, there are items called policies, which are basically rules that govern how a user can interact with SAP for the SAP environments that they're connected to. So let's take a look at managing policies and a little bit about what policies are. So again, if you're an administrator, you would have that feature. Only administrators would be able to manage policies, and it's in the tile section here under the policies tile. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so there are a lot of out-of-the-box policies. So all of these are out of the box. We haven't created any additional ones, although you have the ability to create any new policies you want by adding new policies. So you can create any custom ones. But these are some basic ones that WINSHUTTLE finds most of their customers wanting to use. So they've sort of created them out of the box. And you're welcome to delete them as well. If you want to delete a policy, you select it and delete it. Let's look at these more generic ones down here. These are more generic production and non-production. One for transaction, and there's one for query as well. And then for production, there's transaction and one for query. So let's take a look at the non-production one and see what a policy looks like and how that affects the users. Okay, so this is going to be, the policy name is non-production. The description is connecting to non-production servers and the server type. So this identifies what servers, what SAP environments are applicable to this server policy, to this particular policy. So if you say non-production, that's just going to include any server that you've identified in the application server setup as non-production. So it's generic. It says, okay, if it's non-production, that means any system that you've identified as a non-production will work in this one. Or you can be specific. So, we could change a policy here to be specific to ABC. So if there are other more generic policies, the one that is the most restrictive is the one that's going to apply. So if you wanted to create a specific policy for the ABC environment that we just set up, then you could go ahead and select that, and that policy would apply to that particular environment. The access method is standard. That means any time of the day, any day of the week, any week of the year, or you can be weekly. You can say, the entire week, or specific days. And if you want to give access on certain days, and then you can be more specific around certain times. So maybe you don't want to allow users to do anything on the month end. You want to be careful about month end closing, or maybe you only want finance users to be able to, do something on the month end. So you can pick your particular days that users can apply, that this would apply to. So if you apply this particular policy to a user and they're trying to run a script on the 17th, it won't allow them because their policy does not allow them to do so. So again, it's just trying to manage the users in the most appropriate fashion for what the use case is. Okay, so other things that you can manage in a policy is the number of transactions per run. So if you don't want users to just, open up a spreadsheet and load 100,000 records all at one time, you can limit it to maybe 1,000 records per run. Now, that's not going to stop them from running all of the records in their spreadsheet, but it will enforce that they have to stop every 1,000 records and restart. Okay, so that's what the transactions per run does. The allow SAP transactions allows you to further refine what you want users to do with their access from a transactional level. So allow SAP transaction star means if the user has access to a T code, they can use WINSHUTTLE against it, within the environments they have access to. If you wanted to create a policy maybe more specific to a certain set of users, let's say your master data users, maybe you want to give them MMO1, XDO1, XKO1. So you can be specific about the transactions that they can run with WINSHUTTLE. So you can be very transaction specific. You could put a star. Okay, so any T code that starts with an MM, any T code that starts with an XD, and any T code that starts with an XK would allow them to do that. So that's what I would call, whitelisting, allowing certain transactions, or you can also blacklist certain transactions. Like you can do every transaction except PA40. We don't want users coming in here to create new employee records with WINSHUTTLE, right? Maybe that's too risky or something like that. So you can allow everything but PA40 in this case. So again, really just managing what the users can do. And then this is how you apply it to users. You can apply it to specific users. Like we see here, we see two specific users, WSDev and then student 80. Or you can apply it to groups of users. So these items here are SharePoint groups. So any user that's in one of the SharePoint groups would be assigned this policy. Okay, so you can have policies that are very specific to a client, specific to times of the week or the month, specific to transactions, the number of transactions, and then you assign them to users. So that's what a transaction policy looks like. I'm going to hit cancel as to not mess anything up for us. We'll take a look at a query policy. Very similar concepts, couple different features because we're dealing with queries now instead of T codes. We're dealing with more tables. Again, the production, the server applies the times of the applicability, every day or certain times. Max records to be downloaded. It gives you the number of records you can download if you wanted to specify. And then here, instead of allowing T codes, it would be certain tables. So if you want to do any table that starts with MA or LF or KN, those would give you material master, vendor, and customer type tables. Or you could be more specific to the tables that you want as well, and list them out. Similarly, you can blacklist particular tables or disallow. So like I will give you everything but finance T codes. So we'll put in or finance tables. You can do anything but finance tables. And again, you can assign users to that particular role as well. So system usage levels, this is really with queries is trying to segregate the complexity of the queries, and maybe you only want certain users to be able to run certain complexity type queries. I've never really had to implement that. Usually I just allow everyone to use whatever query they have access to, because the query should have gone through some approval process to validate that it's working and things like that. So usually I just have all those checked and assign all the users to run those, just because the testing should have been accomplished to make sure the script is working. So again, you can assign to users. We see users here, and then groups if you want to assign to groups. Okay, so that's a little bit about updating policies and how you can use policies to manage those items. So I'm just going to take a minute here real quick to see if there are any questions out there. Let's take a look here at the questions section. I'm going to pop that out most. All right, so far everything is, I don't see any slides, so that's fine. Okay, we'll just take a minute to see if any new questions pop in. So one question, instead of deleting a policy, can you just remove from a policy to disable it? Yes, so you don't have to delete policies if you don't want to use them. You could just not assign any people to them. So if I wanted to have a policy here, you can see, for example, we have a number of policies defined where we have no people assigned to them. So only allow use of WINSHUTTLE for journal entry users, for FB50. So we can take a look at that one real quick. And you can see how it applies, but the only transaction that it works for is FB50, but there are no users. So this policy is hanging out there. It's available to be used, but you don't have to have any users assigned to it. So maybe you only want it to be temporary, or add or remove people as you see fit. So yep, very good question. You can create as many policies as you want and assign people to them or not assign people to them. All right, so we'll take a look here to see if there are any more questions that came in. And that is it for right now, so we're good to go. All right, so we'll continue on here and review preferences. Let's take a look at preferences. We will see where those are at. Okay, so in the preferences, again within settings, you can select preferences for each of the tool sets. So let's go ahead and select preferences. And again, in the old Central world, if you're using Central, you had preferences for transaction, you had preferences for query, and they were all different links and you had to click around. Here it's nicely combined into a tabular structure where you can pick a different tab for the different products and manage your preferences. So scheduling for query, you can manage how the preferences for scheduling work. You can pick accounts that should be used to run scheduled items. And if you're going to output the SQL Server, you can pick a specific system account if you so choose, or the user of record that's scheduling. So there are a couple items for schedules. Data files, once completed files go, you can pick a particular document library within SharePoint for that. There's very similar options with Foundation. Where do files go when you're done? What's the default review process? Developer defined is probably the best, unless you always want to use a particular review process. If you pick any of these options here, it's going to force the users to use that one every time. If you use developer defined, then you could have a different review process for each script. Maybe for finance ones, you want to have a review process where the data file specifically has to be reviewed and approved within the user governance tool before it can be run. And maybe for other scripts, maybe for creating a price list or something like that, you don't necessarily need to do that. So you would allow it to be developer defined, so that particular script user could pick no review data process. Again, scheduling, you can allow users to schedule on the desktop where the file's going to go when they're done. And if you schedule something, where do the data files go in a particular sense? If it's completed, we're going to move the file. If it's canceled, so you could have files moved as you see fit. This generally applies to scheduling or auto posting. Okay, so that's a little bit about preferences. And let's take a look at the next topic, which is content and structure. So this really applies to all uses of WINSHUTTLE. Even if you're using Connect, this would apply. Maybe not on a website or something like that, but let's take a look at how that applies. So discussing the content, if we look at content, let's go to transaction scripts. Take a look at scripts here. All right, so you can see we have the transaction scripts document library, we have some folders, we have a whole bunch of T code just sort of at the root level. Generally what we recommend from a best practice, in our environment, we're just throwing things out there to test real quick because we're not using SAP to run our day-to-day business. So it might not follow our standard practices, but generally what I recommend is that you create some kind of folder structure to maintain or group your transaction and queries by that. This allows the user to be more specific in where they want their data files to come from or where they want to point Studio to open up scripts from. And it really just groups them by scripts that that user might want to use on a day-to-day basis. So if you had, let's say, 100 scripts, which is definitely possible or more, and they're all in one little bucket, now you're scrolling through, looking, but you can know it's like, okay, I want to do customer master scripts. So you create a customer master folder, and you put all your customer master scripts within that folder. Now they're easy to identify, and using with user governance, then you can even specify security levels that a particular user only has access to the customer master scripts. You don't allow them to use any of the other scripts. So by having folder level collections of scripts, it's easier for a user to find the script that they're looking for, and also now you can provide some security level. So again, if you're not using Foundation user governance and you're on Connect, I still recommend this type of structure, that you have your scripts sort of stored centrally on a network drive or something like that with a proper folder structure and naming convention, just to organize scripts a little bit better and to allow you to provide security. So if you're using a network drive, you can use AD groups and things like that to manage who has access to what folders. So you can do the same thing with scripts. So you can create a folder to store scripts. You can also do the same thing with data files. So if we look at transaction data files, you can also create folder structures within the data files area. And normally, I would line them up so you have certain content that's lining up. So this is the customer master data, this is material master, this is finance. And you group them together so it's easier to find these files, because if you're submitting a data files for approval, over time you're going to get lots and lots of data files. So you might want to have a good structure and set up to manage that. So that's a little bit about structure and folders. So we just talked about folders. there is a new library or a new folder button. If you wanted to create a new folder, you would simply select new folder, give it a name, and it would show up in your list. And that applies to the transaction scripts library, the data files library, or any of those libraries that you might want to add some structure to. Okay, so naming standards. Again, I know this is a lot on here. Really just want it so it's recorded. But no, I also encourage you to have a naming standard that everyone is following. So then, when you're looking at a set of scripts, you can easily identify the general concepts of what it's doing. Oftentimes start with what the T code is. Start with MMO2. So here's our example: MMO2 change description. And if you want to put a particular environment that you recorded it in or something like that. If you have more than one production system, your environments could be different, and maybe you want to specify a specific, hey, this only works in production system A because it's on 6.0 patch 3, and the other system's still way back on 4.6, so this one doesn't work there. So you can specify to a certain degree what you'd like to do, including a version number if you'd like to identify this is different in some way. If you'd like to do that, but really just trying to identify the T code for transaction, a brief description of what it's going to do, and then any other descriptors that you'd like at the end. But this is really helpful because there's lots of MMO2s that you could do. You could change any number of fields. So you might have 50 different scripts just for MMO2, and identifying them as such with what's updating. Update MRP controller. MMO2 MRP controller. And that would be the name of it. So again, encourage a solid naming convention that everyone's following to make sure that you're able to keep track of what scripts you have and not create duplicate scripts because they're not named appropriately. If you're using Foundation, the shorter the name or the more precise name you can get, the better, because now it's going to turn into a URL. And I think you're limited to 260 characters, including the initial set of characters. So if I'm looking at data files here, let's go back to this transaction scripts folder. So if I hover over this, you can see down in my taskbar down here at the bottom, you can see the full path. So if you have folder within folder within folder and long names, you're going to run into your 260 character limit. If you use spaces in your name, so it's also recommended if you're going to use user governance to use underscores, because spaces are oftentimes translated differently and makes the script hard to read if you're looking at a URL. So by using an underscore, you can see down here at the bottom again, right down here, that the underscore is helpful. If I have a space, let's see if we have any in here with spaces in it. We may not. The space shows up as, no, we don't have any of those. The space shows up as a %20. So now instead of 1 character, it's 3. And if you have 10 spaces in your name, now you have 30 more characters instead of just 10 if you're using spaces. So again, just be aware of naming convention, again, just a note on the number of characters and spaces. So you can see the space shows up like that, making it a little bit more difficult to read. All right, so let's take a look at the next item here. I'm going to flip through this real quick. So determine approval strategies. So when someone's submitting a script for approval, what you have to do within user governance, a user cannot use a script in production SAP without having the script sent to the governance site and approved. So decide what your approval process is going to be. There's a very generic workflow that WINSHUTTLE provides. You submit your script, the user picks who they need to review it, and that reviewer either approves or rejects. But it doesn't give you a detail of what you're actually approving. So that's where the strategy comes into play. So when a reviewer is looking at a script, the concept is, come up with whatever the approval mechanism is that best fits your business model, and that most of your users are already attuned to using for other change management practices. So, before they hit the approve button, does the user have to provide, an Excel file showing they tested a certain number of records? Do they have to show that they tested different, data sets? So company code 1000 and also company code 2000. Did they have to do it in multiple SAP environments? Do you have approval from the customer, the end user that even requested the script, showing that they say, yep, the script does what I think it's supposed to do. And so, define what that documentation process is, what that approval process is, to make sure that everyone's aware of the approval strategy. So when a reviewer gets a task assigned to them to review a script, they know exactly what to do. Almost a checklist of, yep, everything looks good here, validating the naming convention was followed, validating it was submitted to the appropriate folder within your structure. If it's a material master script, it should be in the material master folder. So all of those things. So generally, if you have that kind of setup, the approver doesn't even really need to run the script. So the user may not even, the approver may not even have a WINSHUTTLE license. They're just going through the documentation to validate that the developer and the business user that maybe requested it followed all the necessary steps. So just determine what's best for you to make sure you're following whatever your standards are. It doesn't have to be complicated, but it should be something that you can repeat over and over to prove that you're following a good process for creating scripts. Version control. With user governance, it'll automatically keep track of versions, so you don't necessarily have to have a version number associated with your script name. You could submit an updated script name or an updated script with the same name as one that's already out there, and WINSHUTTLE will say, hey, there's already one out here with that name. Do you want to create a new version? So using SharePoint's version control, you can have a script out there with the same name and multiple versions. If the latest one doesn't work for some reason, at some point you can revert back to older versions. So try to understand what your version control is going to be as well. You're going to submit with the same name and allow WINSHUTTLE to manage the versions for you, or are you going to submit the script with a different name, underscore v1, underscore v2, so you can have visibility to all versions right then without having to go back and try to figure out previous versions through the history mechanism. So there's not one way that's better than the other. We just recommend that you do have a version control process. And additional information, we have some information on the knowledge base if you have access to our knowledge base. Otherwise, WINSHUTTLE support has a bunch of information as well on user governance 11. So I'm going to go through here and touch on a couple common errors that people have when they're using it. We'll try to keep it short since we're running up on time here. A very common one is a script developer or runner receives a message like no policy found. So they have a license, the license was assigned to them, they pick an SAP environment, they go to run it, and it says no policy found for that user. So really, oftentimes what the issue is, like, go into foundation settings and confirm that a policy exists. So we look through all the policies and we touch base on how to add either specific users to that policy or SharePoint groups that policy that person may be in. So if they're getting a no policy found, that means the SAP environment they're trying to connect to is not in any of the policies that they're assigned to. And sometimes that means they don't have any policies because maybe they were a new user, or it's the first time they're connecting the SAP environment and they haven't been assigned that right policy. Issue is the script or developer only sees the test button and it does not switch to run when using an approved production script. So let me flip over to Studio to describe this one here real quick. So in this case, I have a script open, and you can see that I have the run button available. So if I pick another script, if I decide to open another script from the transaction library, so this is connecting to the foundation site, and you can see all of my scripts here have a production status, but let me pick obsolete material. I'm going to switch to that script. You can see that has a production status, but after the script opens, my options are not going to be the same. Okay, so if I look at the Run tab now, you can see that it says Test. I was like, well, that's weird. It was set for production, so usually that means I could run it. That's really the difference between Run and Test, is that Test meaning you can't run it in production yet, and Run meaning you can run it in production if you pick it. So one way to find out, maybe a little what's going on here is on the Foundation tab. So if you're using user governance, that Foundation tab will be there, and you can see under production what the status is. Okay, you can see the workflow. It says review and post separately. That means the data file that you're picking must also be approved before you can run it into production. So the data file that I'm using would have to be submitted to Central and approved before I can open it. So when I open I would need to pick an approved file. Okay, so if I go back to File and Open, and we'll pick from Transaction Script Library, I'll pick the MMO2 Basic Features script. Okay, now let's look at Foundation here. You can see it still has a production status, but this one has no data review process. That means the Excel file I'm using can be any Excel file that I so choose. And let's look at the Run tab, and sure enough, we have the run. So the script is ready for production, it has a production status, and there's no data review required, so I'm good to go. Whatever data file I pick is going to be available for use. So take a look at the settings to see if they have a policy to run production scripts. So if they're not assigned a policy that allows production SAP usage, that could be one problem. Or make sure the script was not published with the data review option. So we saw I'm a runner, I have a production policy, but in one case I had the run button, in the other one I didn't, and that had to do with the data review. One required data review, and the other one didn't. Okay, if you're using query, sometimes the left outer join option in query is grayed out. So if you're trying to join tables and do a left outer join, you have to have specific access in order to do that. So if you go to the query proficiency levels, you can allow that particular user to have a little bit of access to do left outer join. So we'll go to settings. Developer proficiency level is one of the tiles in the settings menu. And depending upon what proficiency level they were given, you know, when you set them up as a user, there was a drop down for those options. Enable left outer joins is one of these checkboxes here. So if you're getting an error when you're trying to convert a script, a query script, and use left outer join capabilities, if that box isn't checked for the proficiency level you're assigned, you're not going to have that option. So the resolution would be either, you know, you're not allowed to do that, or you have your administrator come in and enable the ability to do left outer joins. The next one would be if the script runner chooses an SAP environment that they have access to and receives SAP servers not defined, then there's probably not an application server that's been set up. So at the beginning of the webinar, we looked at setting up the ABC server. And so if they pick something they want to run and it's not set up, they would get that error. And the answer would be if the admin says, yep, you're right, we should be able to use WinShuttle in that environment, that needs to be set up. Okay, and I think that is all she wrote for today. So we're going to skip through some of these other errors. We'll just bring them up real quick. All right, so there's a couple here. If you're using one item here, we'll skip to this one here, the third. If you're using the Run or Excel add-in, one great feature about Studio 11 with the user governance is that it'll look to see if you're using the latest version of that template. So if you have multiple versions with the same name stored in there, and that template is not of the latest version, the user will get a warning, and they won't be allowed to continue until they get the latest version of the template. So there is some inherent version control, but that's only when you're using the Excel add-in. If you're opening the script from Foundation, as I was doing in our examples just there, if you're opening up from Foundation, you'll always get the latest version because you're opening it directly from the source of the truth. But if you have the Excel add-in, you know, the script is built into the Excel file, and you may have that Excel file on your desktop or something like that. So if you go run it and a new version has been released since you've last downloaded the template, you'll get an error, which is a nice feature that's been in the works for a while. Okay, so this is our last chance here for questions. We'll give a moment for questions. I know I went through a lot of information there, sort of in rapid fire. Okay, looks like we're good on the questions. So let's take a look at some of the other items going on with Clear Process and WinShuttle. Let me move the go-to webinar stuff out of the way. So we have some upcoming events. The the WINSHUTTLE user group, so that's the annual user conference, is going to be in Atlanta this year on September 18th and 19th, so coming up in less than a month. If you get there on Sunday, there is a little social Sunday evening if you arrive then. But it looks like, according to the agenda, a lot of good training sessions, and at the end of each day, also some customer breakout sessions. So the day starts off with a keynote, some breakouts for different training if you're interested, and then ends up with customer user sessions each day, little breakout sessions. If you're in the Ohio area, the Ohio WUG is the Ohio WINSHUTTLE user group is going to be meeting on October 26th from 1 to 7. So it's more of a 3-hour session, and then after there's a little after party from 4 to 7 afterwards if you want to stick around to network. So this recording will be out there on YouTube soon, and so when you go to our YouTube site for all of our web tips, they should all be out there, and this one will be out there shortly. So thanks again for your attention today, and thanks for joining this month's web tips. Next month we'll be back focusing on forms and workflow. So every other month we try to mix the topics between studio related and form and workflow. So we'll be back with some more forms and workflow tips and tricks. So thanks for your time today. Really appreciate you attending, and we'll hope to see you next month.